It's March 2018 and there's been a rare fall of snow in southern England, but now it's turning to slush. No better time, one might think, for two Russian sports nutritionists, or at least that's what they say they are, to fly from Moscow to check out the spire of Salisbury Cathedral twice on 2 days running. Here are the two Russians being asked why they did that on Russia Today, a TV channel controlled by the Kremlin.
Salisbury.
Да.
Putin's favourite patsy journalist, Margaret Simonyan, asks, Salisbury? And one of the sports nutritionists says, Da, yes. What makes Salisbury so wonderful? Asked Simonyan. The first sports nutritionist, who calls himself Ruslan Bashirov, spells it out.
Он знаменит своим шпилем 123-метровым.
He's weirdly specific about why he likes the spire, all 123 metres of it. That's 404 feet in old money. What's funny peculiar about this interview is that the two sports nutritionists don't look like medieval architecture buffs. They're thick-set, grim, cold-eyed. To be frank with you, they look like common murderers. And did they go up the spire? Good question. You can climb it. It's 322 steps. I know, because I'm climbing up the spire right now. And I'm going to prove that to you. Listen up. So the two Russians came all the way to London because... And then they came here to Salisbury because they said they wanted to see Salisbury Cathedral's spire. But silly GRU, silly Russian military intelligence, they didn't make it. Shame on them. The view from the spire is out of this world. England's green and pleasant lands set out under a blue sky. Look at this. Look at what Russian military intelligence missed. The two Russians never got close to the spire. A chain of CCTV images show they went in the opposite direction, towards the home of Sergei Skripal. That name might ring a bell for some of you. It's April 2022 and here's Vladimir Putin ordering his defense minister, General Sergei Shoigu, not to seize the steel plant in Mariupol, the last citadel of the Ukrainian army in the port city under siege. Here's a BBC News clip with the master of the Kremlin voiced by a producer with a rather pleasant Scottish brogue.
I consider the proposed storming of the industrial zone unnecessary. I order you to cancel it. This is a case where we must think especially about preserving the lives and health of our soldiers and officers. There's no need to climb into these catacombs and crawl underground through these industrial facilities. Block off this industrial area so that even a fly cannot escape.
While Putin, puffy-cheeked, like a hamster full of straw, bosses around his defense minister, he grips the table fiercely with his hand. It's the kind of thing that sick people and the old do, as if he's not very well. But that's not the key takeaway from Putin's command to cancel the storming of the steel plant. It's mid-May 2022, and as I record this in London, just back from almost 3 months in Kyiv, the Russian army has been storming the steel plant. Now, thanks to the good works of the International Red Cross, the Ukrainian soldiers have been allowed to leave, so far unscathed. But Vladimir Putin is the lord of disinformation, as the Ukrainians know all too well. However, back in 2018, a cathedral city in the heart of England was about to find out about how the Kremlin mangles the truth the hard way. You're listening to Taking on Putin, Episode 8, The View from the Spire. Sergei Skripal was an officer in the GRU, Russian military intelligence, the heaviest bit of the heavy mob. It's common knowledge that the GRU are the most dangerous element of the Russian secret state. Skripal was a Russian spy working first in Malta, then in Spain. At some point, British intelligence, MI6, make him an offer, and he accepts. He starts working for Her Majesty. He's called back to Russia, and he plays it cool, but he's betrayed, and he's locked up for spying for the British. Then there's a big spy swap. If you remember, there are some weird sleepers in the States, the most memorable of whom was a Russian woman who went by the name of Anna Chapman. And she was sitting in New York waiting for the call to be activated. The FBI nick her in 2010, and she, along with 9 other sleepers, are swapped at Vienna airport. 2 planes land, one from the CIA, one from the Russian secret state. And the prisoners are swapped. The Russians get back Anna Chapman, and we get Sergei Skripal and others. Here's the point. In the spy game, that means that Sergei Skripal is no longer on the board. The rules of the spy game are he's untouchable. He was living quietly in the UK, but not in hiding because he assumed, as did MI6, that he was no longer in the game. But the Kremlin doesn't play by the rules. There is something mad and frightening about the ferocity of the vendetta with which Vladimir Putin pursues against people he sees as traitors. Skripal lived in a little house in Christie Miller Road, half an hour's walk from Salisbury Spire. I know because I walked the route the Russians took. On March the 4th, the CCTV shows the 2 men with slush on their boots coming out of Salisbury railway station at 11:46 a.m. They stop to take pictures as they cross the River Avon. At 11:58 a.m., they're caught by the CCTV on the Shell petrol station on Wilton Road, 5 minutes walk from the Skripals' home. The CCTV images don't show the petrol station because it's looking out, but they do show the distinctive metal grid carrying away the water, then the double yellow line. The 2 Russians walk in this direction, not towards the cathedral, but towards the home of Sergei Skripal. The Russians smear the poison on the door handle of Skripal's home. It's not in liquid form, but a kind of gel. You can't see it or smell it. The poison is Novichok, a chemical nerve agent and a weapon of mass destruction, invented and manufactured only in Russia by the Russian secret state. The 2 Russian sports nutritionists are, in fact, poisoners, working for the GRU, Russian military intelligence. The hit didn't work. So, Sergei Skripal and Yulia Skripal had a pint, had lunch and Zizis, and then they came here. They had some bread, and they gave it to 3 little boys who fed the ducks. Then they sat on a park bench over there and passed out. Passing nurse saw Yulia first. You could see the whites of her eyes, and there was froth coming out of her mouth. 999, and the NHS did its magic. But when the news broke out, those 3 boys who were feeding the ducks, they could have been contaminated with the Novichok nerve agent, and so they had to go to the hospital to be checked up. Luckily, they were fine. But that's not the point. The point is, Vladimir Putin and the Russian secret state didn't give a damn. The Kremlin denies the poisoning. The Skripals, father and daughter, got the very best first aid imaginable, a jab of atropine, often given to junkies. Atropine, which originally comes from the poisonous plant deadly nightshade, slows down the nervous system and stops it from crashing. They weren't the only victims. Wiltshire Police sent in a good copper, Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey, to carry out a forensic search of Skripal's home. He got contaminated too. As you already know, I'm bang inside the Spire. So the poisoning of Sergei and Yulia Skripal was against the rules. It was against the rules because Sergei was British. He had been in a spy swap, so theoretically he should no longer have been a target. But what's far worse was the collateral damage to others here in the city of Salisbury, first of all Dawn Sturgis. And that's a bit of medieval ironmongery, remembering her soul. The poisoners never meant to kill Dawn Sturgis, but kill her they did, all the same. When Sergei Skripal and his daughter were poisoned, Salisbury's town centre was sealed and experts in hazmat chemical warfare suits did a fingertip search. Anything contaminated by the Novichok was destroyed. But the killers had one more surprise. The evidence points to the poisoners carrying the Novichok in a fake Nina Ricci perfume bottle and then dumping it in a Salisbury park. 4 months later, Dawn's boyfriend, Charlie Rowley, found what he thought was a perfume bottle. I thought that would make a nice gift. He didn't know it, but the present was from Russia. But not with love. Dawn Sturgis rubbed the perfume into her wrists and passed out very quickly. The emergency services had no idea what they were dealing with, and so she wasn't jabbed with atropine. The dose was fatal, and she died in hospital. Dawn, too, is a victim of the Russian poison factory. Here's Boris Johnson in March 2018 when, as Foreign Secretary, he blasts the Kremlin over the poisoning of Sergei Skripal, who is, let's remember, a British citizen.
The Russian denials grow increasingly absurd. This is a classic Russian strategy of trying to conceal the needle of truth in a haystack of lies and obfuscation. And what really strikes me, talking to European friends and partners today, is that 12 years after the assassination of Alexander Litvinenko in London, they're not fooling anybody anymore.
That clip comes from The Independent, by the way, the newspaper group owned by a former KGB colonel, Alexander Lebedev, and his son Yevgeny, who's great pals with Boris Johnson. Small world, or what? In the wake of the Skripal poisonings, the British government expels 23 Russian diplomats, and our allies around the world throw out another 100 more. So that taught Vlad the poisoner a lesson. Or did it? Bill Browder made a ton of money back in the days of the Wild East, once working out he could buy the old Soviet Arctic fishing fleet for $100 million, though it was worth $1 billion. But in 2009, his Moscow-based lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was murdered by the Russian state. Since then, Bill has gone out of his way to speak truth to the Kremlin's power. And he's got 35 countries to pass legislation, making it less easy for some, but by no means all, of Putin's thugs to park their yachts in Saint-Tropez or their money in the City of London. Browder's been on the Kremlin's wanted list for years, long before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I recorded this interview before the war. Do you think the West is really serious about sending a clear message to Putin to stop mucking around?
I don't think so at all. I mean, the most dramatic and stark example is the case of the Salisbury poisonings, the Skripal poisonings. You had a situation where actors from the Russian state, dispatched by Vladimir Putin, came to the UK and with a military-grade nerve agent, banned nerve agent, administered it on two of their enemies, the Skripals, and they created a massive public health emergency in a British town, in which they had to close the whole town down, and we ended up having a death of a totally innocent bystander, You have a police officer whose life was ruined by this whole thing. And what was the consequence of that? They expelled a bunch of diplomats. And the unspoken secret about expelling diplomats is that they then replaced them with other diplomats. and so there was no consequence. And why was there no consequence? Because deep down, the British government and many other governments are scared of Putin. They don't want to actually pick a fight with him. They're just scared. And so they want to seem to be doing the right thing, but they don't actually want to do the right thing. And so we end up in a world where Putin gets away with murder, literally, on a regular basis around the world.
Expelling diplomats would have caused the Russian spy personnel department a bit of extra work for 2 weeks or so. This is like playing poker, when you're staking pounds sterling, but your opponent is playing with monopoly money. Or, in this case, we're staking British lives, and Vladimir Putin is playing with Novichok. Did the president of Russia show any remorse? Putin was asked about Skripal 6 months after the first wave of poisonings at a conference in Moscow. Listen to the edge in Putin's voice in this clip from Radio Free Europe.
I
see, Putin says, but some of your colleagues are pushing the theory that Mr. Skripal was almost some kind of human rights activist. He was simply a spy, a traitor to the motherland. There is such a concept, a traitor to the motherland. He was one of those. The follow-up question, and was Dawn Sturgis a traitor to the motherland too, Mr. President? Was never asked, because in Vladimir Putin's Russia, there are no follow-up questions. On Russia's Channel 1 TV anchor Kirill Klamyonov warned traitors, don't move to England, something is not right there. Maybe it's the climate, but in recent years there have been too many strange incidents with a grave outcome. People get hanged, poisoned, they die in helicopter crashes, and fall out of windows in industrial quantities. The TV anchor is referring to the list of mystery deaths first reported by BuzzFeed. The hanging refers to Boris Berezovsky, the poisoning to Alexander Litvinenko, the helicopter crash to multi-millionaire Stephen Curtis. He was a British money man for Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was once Russia's richest man. Khodorkovsky dared to challenge Putin and ended up in the slammer in Siberia for 10 years. Curtis and his pilot were killed when their helicopter fell out of the sky on the approach to Bournemouth Airport in 2004. The falling out of a window refers to Scott Young, a British associate of Boris Berezovsky, who may have killed himself in 2014. Or he may have been pushed out of the window. In plain English, the Kremlin's patsy media TV anchor is taking the piss. That said, Russia did get some heat over the Salisbury poisonings. The Kremlin's response to the press conference by the two sports nutritionists was a dark theatre of the absurd. Those two sports nutritionists are not convincing in their TV interview with RT. As I said, they don't look like people in the least bit bothered about beautiful medieval spires. Salisbury, like the rest of Britain, is littered with CCTV cameras. The two men are caught on CCTV at the train station, crossing the River Avon, taking a picture of the ducks walking by the petrol station. Whoever sent them to poison Skripal was an idiot. Even more idiotic is the fake TV interview. The two sports technicians explain that they shared the same bed. Russia under Putin is deeply homophobic. It is against the law to talk about being gay. It's a funny, peculiar piece of information to put across in what is clearly a tightly scripted conversation. But the Kremlin media kept on raising it. Russia 24, a flagship TV show, broadcast a sarcastic report about Salisbury's spirit of modern European tolerance, portraying it as a place packed with gay clubs and parades. Simonian took to Twitter, saying that the two men didn't hit on me. I don't know if they're gay or not gay. They're stylish as far as I can tell, with little beards and cute haircuts, taut trousers and jumpers that tighten around impressive biceps. One explanation for this nonsense is that most ordinary Russians believe that you can't be gay and survive in the special services, so that the two poisoners could not possibly be, as the British government said, from the Russian secret state. The really stupid bit about the whole gay thing is that there is evidence that suggests they're heterosexual. Hitmen's hookers. Our Russian hitmen smoked drugs and had sex with prostitutes. That was the headline in The Sun. The two Russians checked into the 2-star City Stay Hotel in London's East End. One fellow guest recognised one of the duo from the TV pictures later on and told The Sun, "I could smell weed from their room. Later there was a woman in there. I think it was a prostitute. They were having sex, definitely. I heard them having really loud sex for a long time. It was definitely a woman. I don't think the men were having sex with each other. I could still smell the pot." Bellingcat, the glorious British-based investigative website, went to work with independent Russian journalists based in Latvia, working for the website The Insider. They discovered the true identities of the duo. The one who banged on about Salisbury's 123-metre-high spire was, in reality, Colonel Anatoly Chapiga of the GRU. His mate, Dr. Alexander Mishkin, also of the GRU, a medic along for the ride to make sure Chapiga, presumably the poisoner-in-chief, didn't kill himself. The Salisbury poisonings were a clear violation of the international rule of law, of British sovereignty, and of the Queen's peace. The calculation in the Kremlin was that the West wouldn't do much about the outrage. A few days after then Prime Minister Theresa May blasted the Russian secret state for the Salisbury poisonings, Russia's gas giant Gazprom held a highly successful bond sale in the City of London. The Russian embassy in London mocked the United Kingdom, tweeting that demand for the bond sale was 3 times higher than the placing, €750 million. Business as usual? Correct. It was business as usual. Dan Caggetto worked for the US Secret Service, protecting George W. Bush from being poisoned.
We were paid money mostly to worry about the acute sort of chemical terrorism type attack, as opposed to somebody secreting something into the president's food and drink. I'm not going to get into the technical details of how the president of the United States is protected. But, so I was mostly worried about, the bomb with some chemical going off, somebody throwing a mysterious liquid on the limousine or on the president, the waft of gaseous vapor through the room and everybody starting to pass out. I was worried about those scenarios. I was working in this Venn diagram where chemical warfare, terrorism, and assassination run together.
Dan's book, Toxic, A History of Nerve Agents from Nazi Germany to Putin's Russia, is a grimly fascinating read. I chew the fat with Dan about the Salisbury poisonings.
A Russian state assassination and intimidation effort against somebody like Skripal works on several different possible levels. It could very well be, if he dies, that's not a bad thing, but if he lives and he's afraid of us and other people are afraid, that's possibly even more value than him having died. So, let's have a look at the Skripal situation. All right. His survival and his daughter's survival were more down to luck, I think, than anything else, because if they just stayed at home, sat on the sofa, watched television, had a bottle of wine instead of going out, they probably would have both died on the sofa. And it might have been days before anybody knew.
Chris Donnelly spent 14 years at NATO, advising 4 NATO secretaries general on how to read the Kremlin. He knows Russia backwards. I talked to him before the war, when those in the know were extremely frustrated by the lack of seriousness that the threat from Russia was treated with in Britain. How would you characterize what is happening between us and Russia?
We are at war with Russia, and the Russians understand that, and Putin says that. So from a Russian point of view, we are at war with them. From a British or a Western point of view, we most certainly are not. And that's the disparity between the attitudes and in the relationship.
How well are we doing at this war we don't know we're fighting?
We're losing.
Why?
Firstly, because we're not aware that the war is on. And if you don't know you're fighting, you are at a disadvantage from the start. Secondly, if you're going to fight any war, you need a wartime mentality. Because a wartime mentality brings with it attitudes, brings with it, indeed, legal structures, it brings with it different procedures, it brings with it different priorities. So if we're fighting a war but with a peacetime mentality, we aren't going to be doing very well when we are fighting an opponent who has very much a wartime mentality and can therefore more effectively use the weapons in this war, which are no longer simply things that go bang, tanks, ships, planes, bombs and bullets, but virtually everything else in the arsenal of a state, from information, economics, cyber, bribery, corruption, politics, just about everything.
You missed one word, assassination.
Yes, the Russian term is active measures. Active measures are the activities that a state employs which are under the radar of activities, so that the targets hopefully are not aware that they are being practiced.
One thing that I find weird is how aggressive this system is against us. For example, Litvinenko and then Skripal. I mean, the risks they were taking in terms of the likelihood that somebody smart, a clever set of doctors in London would work out, first of all, this with Litvinenko, that this was polonium-210, and with Skripal, they were using Novichok. Those risks were high. Why take these risks? Why is Putin and his gang taking these risks?
Well, firstly, if the enemy, the opponent, let us say, doesn't realise that he's under attack, the risks are not that high. Because generally, human beings tend to see what they're looking for. And if you're not looking for an attack, if you believe that there isn't an attack, or if politically it's highly inconvenient to acknowledge there is an attack on you, then the risks are not high at all. And so, to understand the murders of Litvinenko and the attempted murder of Skripal, it's wrong to see these as a crime. These aren't crimes, they're acts of war. And they only make sense as an act of war. Because in war, you have to take risk. And the Russians, they balance risk and advantage, as you have to do in warfare. You will always have casualties in war. You will have collateral damage. Like Dawn Sturgis is collateral damage.
Let's take Skripal, for example. It was insane for the GRU, Russian military intelligence, to use Novichok against these people because they were going to be discovered. Is that true?
necessarily true, but if you look at the Russian intelligence services, the tradition of its use, a lot of what they do is more effective because it is intimidatory. If it's intimidatory, if it's designed not only to punish, in this case, the individual, but to be a lesson to others, it has to be visible. It has to be seen. They've demonstrated to the principal audience, which is their own people, to the secondary audience, which is their own intelligence officers, and to the third tertiary audience, the Russian diaspora abroad, that whoever you are, we'll come and get you if we want to.
They want you to feel afraid.
Yes.
For Chris Donnelly, I run through my list of about 30 people critical of Vladimir Putin, or just in the way, who've died suspicious deaths, or been shot, or have been poisoned in Russia and in Britain. What is the reason, in your mind, why the British authorities haven't been joining the dots on this stuff?
In truth, I don't know. A surmise might be that to do so would force them to acknowledge the problem, and that to acknowledge the problem would be embarrassing and awkward, and maybe financially disadvantageous to the City of London, which has a lot of influence on the government and which is a very large recipient of Russian money.
The evidence that Vladimir Putin is behind at least some of these killings, for example those of Alexander Litvinenko and Dawn Sturgis, is compelling. And that raises huge questions for our foreign policy and how we deal with the poisoner in the Kremlin. Tom Tugendhat is a Tory MP and the chair of the Common Foreign Affairs Committee. He's also fought in Afghanistan, but that could be another podcast. I interviewed him months before Putin's February 22 invasion of Ukraine, but his take stands the test of time. Do people here in Britain understand the nature of the threat from the Russian secret state?
I don't think people understand the full interwoven nature of the Russian state with its secret elements. We're not looking at a state that has services that support it. We're looking at a service that also has a state. And this service, in this case, it's not a military dictatorship, it's an intelligence dictatorship. It's a dictatorship based entirely on those members who were key senior members of the KGB in the late 80s and then early 90s.
How much is Vladimir Putin the leader of the gang, and how much is he very much part of the gang, and that therefore he doesn't have that much wriggle room?
Well, he's both. I mean, he's very much part of the gang in the sense that these are the people he grew up with. He trained with them. He worked with them over many, many years. In various different ways, they supported his rise and they enabled his success. But he's also the leader. You know, he really does make the decisions. He really is the Tsar of all the Russias at the moment, and he has the ultimate decision over many issues. Could he go against everybody? No, probably not. But he could certainly go against quite a lot of individuals, and he is very, very much the master of all he surveys. But there was a NATO exercise Able Archer, which has been famously serialised in Deutschland 83, actually, which is why I'm pretty sure it is 83, yes. Which is an amazing programme if you haven't watched it. The operation in 1983, or the exercise in 1983, was designed to test NATO's readiness. But the Soviet Union didn't think it was that. They thought it was the precursor to an assault on the Soviet Union, and a nuclear assault at that. And the entire KGB in East Germany, and probably around the world actually, was focused on trying to work out what was happening. Now that level of paranoia has really been part of Putin's DNA ever since he first left spy school in the 70s. This is a guy who has grown up with a complete attitude that the West is out to get him and his operatives, and that anybody who ends up turning is a traitor. And it's a very, very fortress Russia mentality. That idea that great Russia must be great by geographic conquest is absolutely fundamental, and therefore the view that the West is eroding that geographic might is absolutely essential.
So what's scary here is this is a conversation between them and us, and they are paranoid about us undermining and eroding them, and we don't understand that level, the level of their aggression. How do we deal with Vladimir Putin's aggression?
Well, I think the most important thing to do is to be absolutely clear where the limits lie, and this is something that we haven't always been very good at. Look, we've seen a nuclear weapon, polonium, being used here in London. We've seen a chemical weapon being used in Salisbury. These are, if not acts of war, these are warlike acts. These are clear breaches of every international convention, and in former days, these are the sort of things that would have triggered full-on conflict, or at least retaliation. I'm glad they haven't, but we do need to be clear that actually we will retaliate in other ways. And I think that the most important way in which we can respond is to hit the money. Because although this is an intelligence dictatorship, it's also, like dictatorships throughout history, an enormously corrupt dictatorship. The people who are at the centre of it, from Putin down, are multi-billionaires, not through any of their own effort, but because they have stolen the money off the Russian people for 20, 30 years.
We need to follow the money, and we need to, and our spooks can do that, but at the moment their stuff isn't being published. To be clear, by this I mean that British intelligence knows where a lot of Russian secret money is sitting in the West. But they haven't shared it properly with the newspapers, so the public is still in the dark.
Yeah, but that's a decision by ministers, that's not a decision by intelligence services.
Do you think ministers are wrong for sitting on it?
I think ministers could be a lot bolder with the information that they have.
We're not really pushing back in a way. Bearing in mind, as you said, a nuclear weapon and a chemical weapon used in Britain. 2 British citizens, Litvinenko and Dawn Sturgis, dead because of them mucking around with weapons of mass destruction.
Almost certainly more than that, actually. To have foreign agents committing criminal acts in the UK...
Murder.
Yes, and many other criminal acts in the UK is extremely worrying.
So Donald Rayfield, professor, author, by the way, of Stalin and His Hangman, the definitive book about Stalin's secret policeman, says this feels to him that we're in 1938, but that we're appeasing the Kremlin.
I think we're making unwise political decisions. And those unwise decisions are things like tolerating dirty money in the UK, or not being bold enough in standing up alongside several of our Eastern European friends and allies, and indeed calling out those who are more openly appeasing the Kremlin. We need to be quite clear that our defence doesn't start at Dover, but thousands of miles to the east, and every chunk of territory that is eroded away, whether by corruption or political advancement, weakens the United Kingdom and weakens British citizens.
Tom Tugendhat is right. I saw the free Western world being defended by people in Ukrainian army uniforms, thousands of miles to the east of London. Now, listen to the sound of democracy in Russia dying. This is the moment Alexei Navalny, the Russian politician the Kremlin fears the most, howls in agony as his central nervous system is being attacked by Novichok. And this time, there isn't a cathedral spire in sight. Look out for our next episode. the underpants poisoner. You've been listening to Taking on Putin, Episode 8, The View from the Spire. The Kremlin, the Russian state, Vladimir Putin, and the two Russians captured on CCTV going towards Sergei Skripal's home deny poisoning, deny any wrongdoing. Thanks to RT for the clip of the two sports technicians. Thanks also to BBC News, Radio Free Europe and The Independent. Taking on Putin is a podcast series written and reported by me, John Sweeney, for Black Dog Woof Woof Productions. It's produced by Chalk and Blade in London. The executive producer is Laura Sheeter, with other production by the team. It's mixed and sound designed by Alex Bort-Felix, with original music by Thomas Hewitt-Jones. I've launched a crowdfunder to help fund this podcast, Taking on Putin. There are loads of costs. Lawyers, checking things out, making sure that it gets to all the right platforms, making sure that the people that I'm working with, and I, are safe from legal and other threats. I'm not going to spell them out, but use your imagination. So, if you're going to help me tell this story, please help me crowdfund it. In your search engine, dial in crowdfunder, Taking on Putin with me, John Sweeney. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you for coming along for the ride. The Kremlin won't like it. Take care, and love from London.